We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every notification.
Early in the investigation, according to investigators, a piece of evidence was identified that did not belong. It wasn't immediately visible. It wasn't something anyone noticed at first glance. But once it was isolated and examined more closely, it introduced a question that investigators have not been able to fully answer. Because whatever that material was, it didn't match Nancy Guthrie. And based on available information, it didn't appear to match anyone who was supposed to have been inside her home. Now think about that for a moment. If the space was controlled, if access was limited, and if the timeline suggested no unusual activity, then how does unidentified biological material appear in a place it shouldn't be? That question, quiet at first, quickly became central to everything that followed. Everything in this case, according to investigators, begins with a routine that didn't happen. Nancy Guthrie was known for consistency. Family members, based on reports, described her as someone who followed a predictable structure, the kind of person who didn't simply miss commitments without explanation. So when she failed to show up for a scheduled obligation, concern didn't take long to surface. At first, investigators approached the situation the way they typically do. They began by establishing a timeline. When was she last seen? Who spoke to her? What activity could be verified? But almost immediately, there was a problem. The timeline had a gap. Not a large one, not something obvious, but enough to raise questions. Because there was a period of time unaccounted for where no one could clearly confirm what had happened inside that home. And that, by itself, might not have been unusual. But then, the forensic detail emerged. And suddenly, that missing time window meant something very different. Now here's what matters. According to investigators, once the property was processed, certain traces were identified that required further analysis. These weren't conclusions. They weren't immediate answers. They were simply indicators that something didn't fully align with the initial assumptions. One of those indicators was biological. Reportedly, samples were collected from inside the residence, and when those samples were examined, at least one result did not match Nancy Guthrie. But that wasn't the part that concerned investigators most. Because, based on available information, it also did not match anyone known to have regular access to that home. This is where things begin to change. Because now the question isn't just about where Nancy is. It becomes a question about who else might have been there. At this point, investigators began to reconsider the timeline. Up until then, the working assumption had been relatively straightforward, that Nancy's disappearance occurred within a known window, possibly connected to routine activity, possibly involving someone familiar. But the presence of unidentified DNA introduced a complication. Because if that material was recent, then someone else had been inside that home during a time that had not yet been accounted for. And if that's true, then the original timeline is incomplete. And that raises a different question. Was the missing time window actually longer than investigators first believed? To understand why that matters, you have to look at how timelines are built. They are not based on assumptions. They are based on confirmation, phone activity, witness statements, verified movements. But when one of those elements is missing, or when a new detail doesn't fit the entire structure, has to be reconsidered. And that appears to be what happened here. Because according to investigators, once the forensic findings were introduced, attention shifted, subtly at first, then more directly, toward the possibility that the original sequence of events was not accurate. Now at this point, investigators believed they understood what happened. But that changed. Because alongside the DNA findings, there were other small details that didn't quite align. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to suggest that something had been overlooked. For example, based on available information, there were no immediate signs of forced entry. Doors appeared secured, windows intact, no visible disruption that would suggest an external break-in. And that would normally suggest something important, that whoever entered the home may not have needed to force their way in. But that doesn't fully explain the DNA. Because even if access was voluntary or at least not resisted, that still leaves one critical question unanswered. Who was it? Investigators, according to reports, began expanding their scope. They reviewed known contacts. They re-examined recent interactions. They looked at anyone who might have had a reason or an opportunity to be present. And this is where one detail starts to stand out. Because in cases like this, behavior matters just as much as evidence. Who reacts quickly? Who doesn't? Who provides clear information? Who hesitates? Not as proof of anything, but as context. And according to investigators, there were individuals within Nancy's immediate circle whose timelines required closer examination, not because they were identified as suspects, but because their accounts needed to be aligned with the emerging forensic picture. Think about the sequence. A routine is broken. A timeline develops a gap. Forensic evidence appears that does not match the known environment, and access to the home does not appear forced. Each of these details, on its own, might not be significant, but together they begin to form a pattern. A pattern that suggests something happened inside that home that has not yet been fully explained. And this is where the central question becomes unavoidable. If the DNA is accurate, and if it truly does not belong to Nancy or anyone expected to be there, then someone else was present. Not hypothetically, not theoretically, but physically, inside that space, at some point in time. Now here's where things become even more complicated. Because according to investigators, the timing of that presence is still unclear. There is no confirmed moment that explains when that individual would have entered or left. No clear indication of how long they may have remained. And no direct connection, at least based on publicly available information linking that individual to Nancy herself. So now the investigation is dealing with two unknowns. Not just what happened to Nancy, but who this other person might be. And that creates a contradiction. Because if someone else was inside the home, then either they were there during the missing time window, or the timeline itself is missing something more significant. Something earlier, something that hasn't yet been identified. Investigators, based on available information, have not publicly confirmed the identity connected to that DNA. They have not stated whether it has been matched, partially matched, or remains unknown. And that silence, in cases like this, often means one of two things. Either the analysis is ongoing, or the result is more complicated than expected. Now think about that. If the DNA has not been identified, then the investigation is still open in a very specific way. But if it has been identified and not yet released, then that suggests something else entirely. Something investigators are still working to understand. Because at the center of all of this is one unresolved issue. Not just the presence of DNA, but the absence of clarity. And that brings us back to the core question. What happened during the missing time window? Because if that DNA belongs to someone outside Nancy's known circle, then that window may not just be a gap. It may be the key to the entire case. And if that's true, then one question remains. If investigators now have that DNA, and possibly even an identity, why hasn't it clarified what happened inside that home? At this point in the investigation, according to investigators, attention began to shift away from what was immediately visible and toward what couldn't yet be explained. Because the presence of unidentified DNA did not just introduce a new detail, it challenged the structure of the case itself. Up until then, the working theory had been built around a controlled environment, a home with no visible signs of forced entry, a routine that appeared to have been interrupted but not violently disrupted. But now, that assumption no longer held the same weight. Because if someone else had been inside that space, someone unaccounted for, then the idea of control begins to break down. And that forces investigators to ask a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but when did control of the situation change? Now here's what matters. According to investigators, once the forensic results were flagged as inconsistent with known individuals, the next step was comparison. Databases, prior records, known profiles. This is standard procedure, but based on available information, the result did not immediately lead to a clear match. And that creates a very specific kind of uncertainty. Because in many cases, unidentified DNA will either point towards someone already in the system, or it won't. And if it doesn't, then investigators are left with a presence they can confirm but not yet explain. But that wasn't the only issue. Because alongside the DNA, there were subtle inconsistencies in how the timeline had originally been presented. Not major contradictions, not direct conflicts, but small shifts. Moments that, when revisited, didn't align as cleanly as they first appeared. For example, according to investigators, certain expected activities could not be independently verified. Routine communications that should have occurred, but didn't. Movements that were assumed, but not confirmed. And this is where things begin to tighten. Because when timelines rely on assumption rather than verification, they create space. And in that space, uncertainty grows. Now at this point, investigators believe they understood what happened, but that changed. Because once the timeline was re-examined in light of the DNA evidence, a new possibility began to emerge. That the original window of interest may have been defined too narrowly. Think about that. If investigators were initially focused on a specific period of time based on last known contact or expected activity, then anything outside that window may not have been fully explored. And if the unidentified DNA was left during an earlier moment, then the key event may have occurred before anyone was looking. This is where things become more complex. Because according to investigators, expanding a timeline isn't just about adding hours. It's about reevaluating behavior. Who had access earlier? Who had opportunity before concern was raised? And, more importantly, who would not immediately stand out? At this stage, investigators reportedly began to look more closely at patterns. Not just who was present, but how they behaved. Because in cases like this, behavior often reveals what evidence alone cannot. Did someone act differently than expected? Did someone provide information that later required adjustment? Did someone appear to know more or less than they should have? These are not conclusions, but they are indicators. And according to investigators, those indicators began to point in directions that had not been fully considered at the start. But that wasn't the part that raised the most concern. Because alongside behavioral review, there was another layer being examined: access. Specifically, how someone could enter a home without leaving clear signs behind. Now, here's where things shift again. Because based on available information, investigators did not find immediate evidence of forced entry, which suggests something important. Either the person had permission, or they had familiarity. And both possibilities carry very different implications. If access was voluntary, then that suggests Nancy may have known the person, at least enough to allow them inside. But if access was based on familiarity, knowledge of the home, its layout, its entry points, then that suggests something else: planning, understanding, awareness of how to move through the space without raising alarm. And that creates a new contradiction. Because if the DNA belongs to someone unfamiliar, then how did they gain access without disruption? But if the DNA belongs to someone familiar, then why has that connection not been clearly established? Investigators, according to reports, began mapping these possibilities, not as final theories, but as working models. And each model had its own set of questions. If the individual was known, why is their presence not already accounted for? If the individual was unknown, how did they enter and exit without detection? And if the timing of that presence remains unclear, then when did the critical event actually occur? Now think about how these questions connect, because each one leads back to the same central issue: the timeline. At this stage, investigators reportedly revisited digital records, phone activity, message logs, device usage, looking for any indication that could anchor specific moments in time. Because in modern investigations, digital footprints often provide the structure that physical evidence alone cannot. But based on available information, even that review did not fully resolve the uncertainty. In fact, in some cases, it added to it. Because, according to investigators, there were moments where expected activity simply wasn't there. Gaps. Not necessarily long ones, but noticeable. And when those gaps were compared against the physical evidence, something didn't align. This is where things begin to narrow. Because now investigators are not just looking for what happened. They are looking for what didn't happen, what was expected but missing, what should have been recorded but wasn't. And that absence can be just as important as presence, because it suggests interruption. A break in routine, a moment where something changed. Now at this point, investigators believe they were getting closer. But another detail complicated that assumption, because according to reports, the DNA itself may not have been complete, meaning it may not have been a full profile. And if that's the case, then identification becomes more difficult. Partial matches, probabilistic connections, nothing definitive. And that creates a different kind of limitation, because without a full profile, investigators may be able to suggest a direction, but not confirm it. So now, the investigation is balancing three uncertainties at once: an incomplete timeline, an unidentified or only partially identified presence, and a sequence of events that does not fully align with either. And when those elements overlap, they don't simplify the case, they complicate it. Because if the DNA cannot yet be fully confirmed, and the timeline cannot yet be fully reconstructed, then the central question remains unresolved. Not just who was there, but when were they there, and what happened during that moment. And this is where everything begins to converge. Because if investigators are now working with an expanded timeline and a presence that doesn't fully fit within it, then one possibility begins to stand out: that the most important moment in this case has not yet been clearly identified. And if that's true, then everything built around the original timeline may be incomplete. So now the investigation faces a critical turning point. Do they focus on identifying the DNA first? Or do they focus on redefining the timeline that might explain it? Because depending on which answer comes first, the entire direction of the case could change. And that leads to a final question for this stage of the investigation. If the DNA cannot yet fully identify the person, and the timeline cannot yet fully explain their presence, then what piece of information are investigators still missing that connects the two? By this stage of the investigation, according to investigators, the case had reached a point where information was no longer simply being gathered, it was being reevaluated. Because the more they looked at what they had, the more it became clear that something didn't fully connect. The DNA suggested a presence, the timeline suggested uncertainty, and the behavior surrounding the case suggested that not everything had been clearly understood. Now here's what matters. When an investigation reaches this point, the focus shifts, not toward adding new details, but toward finding the one detail that explains everything else. At first, according to investigators, that detail was expected to come from the forensic side, the DNA, because if that profile could be fully identified, then theoretically, it would answer multiple questions at once. Who was inside the home? When they might have been there? And possibly, why? But based on available information, that clarity did not come as quickly as expected. Because as investigators continued to work through the analysis, there were indications that the DNA might not lead to a straightforward identification. And that creates a very specific kind of problem. Because when evidence confirms presence, but does not confirm identity, it forces investigators to look somewhere else for answers. And that somewhere else often becomes behavior, patterns, reactions, details that don't immediately stand out, but begin to take on meaning when viewed in context. Now at this point, investigators believed they were close to narrowing the direction, but that changed. Because as they revisited earlier assumptions, one possibility began to surface more clearly: that the presence indicated by the DNA may not have occurred during the moment everyone was focused on. Think about that. If the unidentified DNA was not left during the disappearance itself, then it may have been left before. And if that's true, then the investigation may have been anchored to the wrong moment in time. This is where things begin to shift in a different direction. Because according to investigators, once that possibility was considered, the focus expanded again. Not just forward, but backward. Looking at earlier interactions, Earlier access points, earlier opportunities. And this is where one detail begins to stand out. Because based on available information, there were individuals who had access to Nancy's home prior to the day she was reported missing. Routine access, expected access, nothing unusual on its own. But when viewed alongside the DNA, it introduces a different kind of question. Because if someone had been inside the home earlier, and their presence was never considered unusual, then their DNA might not have been questioned at the time it was left. But that raises a contradiction, because investigators did question it, which suggests something important, that the DNA did not align with those expected individuals. So now the investigation is facing two competing possibilities. Either the DNA belongs to someone outside the known circle, or it belongs to someone within it, whose presence was not fully accounted for. And both possibilities carry very different implications. If the DNA belongs to someone outside the known circle, then the issue becomes access. How did they enter? Why were there no signs? What allowed them to move through that space without detection? But if the DNA belongs to someone within the known circle, then the issue becomes timing. When were they there? Why does their presence not align with the established timeline? And what might have happened during that moment that has not yet been explained? Now here's where things become even more complex. Because according to investigators, there were subtle differences in how certain individuals described their interactions leading up to the disappearance. Not contradictions, not direct inconsistencies, but variations, details that were described one way initially and slightly differently later. And in most cases, that might not mean anything. Memory shifts, perspective changes. That's normal. But when those variations occur in a case where the timeline is already uncertain, they take on a different significance. Because now, investigators are not just looking at what people said, they are looking at when they said it. And how it changed over time? This is where behavior and evidence begin to intersect. Because if a timeline is unclear and statements evolve, then the gap between those two things becomes a place investigators have to examine closely. Now at this point, investigators believed they were beginning to understand the pattern, but one final issue remained: the sequence. Because even if the DNA could eventually be linked to a person, and even if the timeline could be expanded to include their presence, there is still one question that has not been fully answered. What happened inside that home? And that question is more difficult than it seems, because it's not just about identifying individuals. It's about reconstructing actions, movements, moments that were never directly observed. According to investigators, this is where cases often reach their most critical stage, when all the pieces exist, but they have not yet been arranged in the correct order. Now think about everything together: a routine that was broken, a timeline with a gap, DNA that does not match expected individuals, access with no visible force, behavior that requires closer examination, and a sequence of events that remains unclear. Each of these elements points towards something, but none of them, on their own, provide a complete answer. And that's what makes this case different, because the evidence is not missing. It's disconnected. Now here's the part that investigators are still working to understand: whether those pieces connect to a single moment or multiple moments that have been mistaken for one. Because if everything happened within one event, then the timeline simply needs to be corrected. But if the DNA, the behavior, and the missing time window belong to different moments, then the investigation may be dealing with something more layered than initially believed. And that possibility changes everything, because it suggests that what appears to be one event may actually be a sequence. And if that's true, then the central question becomes more precise: not just what happened, but how many things happened, and in what order. And until that sequence is fully understood, the case remains unresolved in a very specific way. Because even if investigators now have the DNA, even if they are closer to identifying who it belongs to, that alone does not explain the most important part. What actually happened inside that home during the moment everything changed? And until that question is answered with clarity, there will always be one final uncertainty. If the DNA leads to a person, will it explain the timeline? Or will it reveal that the timeline itself was never what investigators thought it was?